April 7, 1945. Tokyo Bay. Dawn breaks over the Empire of Japan, and with it one of the most defining moments in aerial warfare. 91 North American P-51D Mustangs of the 15th and 21st Fighter Groups slice through the upper atmosphere, their polished aluminum skins glinting in the rising sun like streaks of molten silver. In the cockpit of his Mustang Major, James B. Tapp adjusts his oxygen mask, feeling it stiffen against the cold air. Beneath his gloved hands, the control stick hums with life, a living conduit between man and machine. Each Mustang carries 650 caliber M2 Browning machine guns, their ammunition belts packed tight with armor-piercing incendiary rounds. For the early model P-51Ds, that means roughly 500 rounds per inboard gun, and 270 for the outer guns, a total of 2,880 rounds of lethal precision. Later models would sacrifice ammunition for reliability, but on this day, raw firepower rules the sky. Below Mount Fuji rises like a god from the earth, its snow-capped peak piercing a morning haze so pure that it becomes a beacon for navigation. Pilots fix their headings by its silhouette, a symbol of beauty and impending destruction. As sunlight stretches across Japan's heartland, it illuminates a nation still unaware that within hours, its skies will no longer belong to its defenders. The mission before these men is unprecedented escort B-29 superfortresses deep into the Japanese homeland, 750 miles from their base at Iwo Jima. Just 2 years earlier, such a feat had been dismissed as impossible for a single-engine fighter. Yet here they are, living proof of how American engineering and industrial resolve have redefined what impossible means. At 0700 hours, the radar screens of Japan's air defense flicker alive. More than 100 interceptors scramble streaking upward from the Tokyo plain. In their cockpits, Japanese pilots squint through the mist and see something that freezes their blood. Single-engine American fighters, not bombers over the imperial capital. It is a vision their commanders had promised would never come to pass. The shock ripples through the Japanese air service like an earthquake. These are not the short-range carrier fighters of the U.S. Navy. These are long-range Army Air Force machines, land-based Mustangs that have somehow crossed open ocean, fought the winds, and arrived with enough fuel to battle and return. It is a revelation so profound that one Japanese ace later wrote, "In that moment, I knew the war was already lost." The defenders rise in a chaotic mix of aircraft. The Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate Gale leads the charge, supported by aging Ki-43, Hayabusas, Ki-44, Shokis, Ki-61, Hyans, and even the naval N-1K2J Shidens. The Ki-84, Japan's fastest and most advanced fighter, could outclimb or outturn the Mustang in specific conditions, but conditions were fleeting, and the battlefield was never ideal. The next hour will reveal that Japan's problem is not bravery or skill, but numbers, technology, and time all slipping away. The P-51D Mustang, newly arrived in the Pacific after breaking the Luftwaffe in Europe, is a culmination of two nations' genius. Initially designed for Britain, the Mustang's transformation began when British engineers fitted it with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, a decision that turned an average performer into a world beater. The American-built Packard V1657, a licensed Merlin, delivered 1,695 horsepower at takeoff, climbing smoothly into the thin air at 25,000 feet, where Japanese engines choked and gasped. At those heights, the Mustang could reach 440 miles per hour, far beyond the reach of most Japanese interceptors. Its two-stage, two-speed supercharger kept the engine breathing easily, even where oxygen was scarce, an advantage that meant life or death in vertical dogfights. Japanese aircraft with their single-stage compressors faltered above 20,000 feet, their pilots fighting both their enemies and the atmosphere itself. In terms of pure firepower, the Mustang's 6 Brownings were a symphony of destruction. 4,800 rounds per minute, roughly 80 rounds each second. Each incendiary bullet, traveling at nearly 2,900 feet per second, could shred through engine blocks, ignite fuel, and tear a bomber apart in a heartbeat. It was the mathematics of modern warfare: velocity multiplied by mass multiplied again by industrial scale. By late 1944, the P-51 had become the backbone of the U.S. 8th Air Force in Europe. 14 of 15 fighter squadrons flew Mustangs, a testament not only to the aircraft's performance, but to the factory floors behind it. In California and Texas, assembly lines glowed with molten rivets 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. A new Mustang rolled off production lines every hour, a pace the Axis could not even dream of matching. By war's end, over 15,000 P-51s would be built, 156 of them, the D variant alone, exceeding Japan's total fighter output for the last 2 years of the conflict combined. This was more than engineering. It was strategy through production. The Mustang was not just a plane. It was proof that America's greatest weapon was not steel or fire, but scale. With dual 110-gallon drop tanks, a P-51D could cruise nearly 1,500 miles Los Angeles to Little Rock entirely over open water and still fight upon arrival. Its laminar flow wings, designed by aerodynamicist Edgar Schmood, cut drag by 35%, preserving fuel and speed. Meanwhile, the Merlin engine consumed just 65 gallons per hour at economy cruise efficiency that turned geography itself into an ally. In contrast, Japan's Ki-84 Hayate arrived too late and in too few numbers to change anything. Entering service in mid-1944, the Hayate represented a desperate attempt to balance design brilliance with the crumbling infrastructure of a nation under siege. On paper, the aircraft was formidable: twin 20mm and 30mm cannons, excellent climb, and agile handling. But on the factory floor, mass production meant a few dozen per month prototypes by American standards. Even its guns betrayed the imbalance. Each 30mm cannon carried just 50 rounds, the 20mm 150. Together, a Hayate pilot entered battle with 400 rounds, a fraction of the Mustang's load. Powering the Hayate was the Nakajima He-45 Homar, an 18-cylinder radial engine theoretically capable of 2,000 horsepower. In reality, it was a masterpiece sabotaged by scarcity. Fuel injection systems failed, pistons cracked, and engines seized mid-flight, the predictable result of factories running under bombardment, starved of quality steel and copper. In the field ground, crews struggled to keep these delicate machines alive. Landing gear collapsed from bad metallurgy. Engines overheated their single-stage superchargers, struggling above 20,000 feet. What Japan had in innovation, it lacked in material consistency. The contrast between the two nations' industrial bases was absolute. America's factories improved with each month of war, refining assembly, standardizing parts, learning from feedback loops between pilots and engineers. Japan's declined with every air raid, every lost transport, every smuggled shipment of low-grade aluminum. By 1945, Japan had built only 3D-500 Hayats in total, of which barely half ever flew combat missions. Fuel, not courage, grounded the rest. And that fuel shortage was self-inflicted, the inevitable outcome of a war launched to secure oil and ended in exhaustion. While American pilots flew on a 100-octane gasoline refined in Texas and shipped halfway across the world, Japanese pilots filled their tanks with mixtures so weak they barely ignited, sometimes 87 octane, sometimes worse. Pilots tried supplementing it with pine root oil or ethanol distilled from sweet potatoes, but the results were catastrophic. Engines coughed, sputtered, and died mid-air. In the end, the disparity between the P-51 and the Ki-84 was not simply one of machines, but of civilizations in different industrial epochs. The Mustang was the child of an industrial democracy mobilized for total war. The Hayate, the orphan of an empire running on fumes. And so, as the Mustangs crossed the coastline of Honshu that morning, dropping their empty fuel tanks into the sea and spotting the first Japanese interceptors, history itself turned. The Pacific sky would never belong to Japan again. At 0700 hours, the first radar operators around Tokyo picked up incoming blips that made no sense. Enemy aircraft, many of them. The alarm sounded across airfields from Chofu to Atsugi as pilots scrambled to their machines. Within minutes, the air filled with the thunder of radial engines. Nakajima Ki-84, Hayate's Ki-61, Hein's Ki-43, Hayabusas, and a handful of aging Zeros. Many were flown by men barely out of flight school, others by veterans whose faces bore the exhaustion of years of hopeless struggle. From above, the Mustang pilots watched the rising chaos. They had crossed 750 miles of open ocean to arrive almost to the second at their rendezvous point. The rendezvous itself, a coordination miracle, testified to the precision of American navigation. The B-29s appeared below like slow, gleaming giants, each carrying tons of incendiaries bound for Japanese industrial centers. The Mustangs banked into escort formation, silver wings flashing in the sunlight. The first contact came suddenly. A swarm of Japanese fighters dove from altitude guns blazing. Major Tapp rolled into the attack, his Merlin engine screaming as he pulled into a tight climb and then reversed into a steep dive. His machine guns spat fire. Tracers tore through the sky, arcing into the enemy formation. Seconds later, a Hayate disintegrated in flame. For the Japanese pilots, disbelief turned to horror. These were not carrier-based fighters from a fleet. These were long-range Army aircraft appearing where none should be. Flight Sergeant Totanamizu of the 56th Sentai later recalled, "We were told no American fighter could reach Tokyo. When I saw them, I thought I was dreaming." That psychological blow was as devastating as any bomb dropped on Tokyo's factories. The P-51D was not merely fast, it was balanced, stable, and forgiving at the limits of flight. American pilots could dive at 500 mph and still maintain control. Japanese aircraft designed for agility at low altitude suffered catastrophic structural failure above 400 mph. Their light frames twisted, or their wings simply tore away. The Mustang's laminar flow wings and robust structure allowed them to dominate the vertical plane of combat diving and climbing at will. Within minutes, the battle devolved into chaos. The Mustangs formed fluid four-plane elements coordinating through crisp VHF radios. They attacked in slashing passes, conserving energy and ammunition. Japanese formations relying on outdated three-plane Shodai tactics and weak radios disintegrated quickly. Major Tapp's after-action report described it coldly. They came at us in three-plane groups, but lacked coordination. We dove through with a 100 mat advantage, fired short bursts, and climbed back out before they could react. What had once been the disciplined Imperial Air Force was now a fragmented force of desperate pilots, flying machines their country could barely maintain. Behind the air battles lay the deeper tragedy of attrition. Japan had lost most of its veteran aviators in earlier campaigns, the Solomons, New Guinea, the Philippines. By 1945, many replacements had fewer than 100 hours of total flight time, some less than 50. In contrast, American pilots averaged 600 hours with extensive gunnery and formation training. Combat had become mathematics skill multiplied by machine quality, divided by dwindling fuel and hope. Fuel shortages in particular crippled Japan's air effort. As oil fields fell to Allied control, the empire's supply evaporated. Japanese refineries resorted to producing synthetic fuel from coal or pine roots, a process so inefficient it barely sustained training flights. The aviation gasoline often tested below 87 octane, far short of the 100 octane fuel that fed the Mustang's supercharged engines. The result: lower power, shorter range, and catastrophic engine wear. Pilots described engines that ran rough, sputtered on takeoff, or simply failed in midair. Ground crews worked miracles to keep aircraft operational, often cannibalizing wrecks for spare parts. Landing gear failures became common, claiming as many planes as combat itself. In one unit, 3 aircraft collapsed on landing in a single week, each loss irrecoverable. American ground logistics, by contrast, functioned like a symphony. On Iwo Jima, new parts arrived daily aboard Liberty ships and C-54 transports. Ground crews worked around the clock, performing engine swaps in hours, patching bullet holes overnight. At the height of operations, Mustangs maintained an 80% readiness rate, despite volcanic dust salt air and minimal facilities. Japan's comparable rate often fell below 40%. As the Mustangs swept over the Japanese homeland, the symbolism was unmistakable. For the first time, Japan's heartland lay open to attack by single-engine fighters machines that had traveled farther than the empire's most ambitious planners had imagined possible. It was a feat of engineering, logistics, and training so complete that it rendered traditional defense obsolete. Down below, civilians in Tokyo looked up from rice fields and factories to see the impossible American fighters streaking across their skies, their silver wings flashing in the morning light. The myth of the divine wind that would protect Japan began to crumble. Captain Art Bridge of the 45th Fighter Squadron later described that sight. The bombers looked like a school of silver fish gliding in formation. The Mustangs above us moved like their guardians, fast, confident, unstoppable. By noon, the battle was over. 26 Japanese aircraft fell from the sky. 5 more were damaged beyond repair. The Americans lost 2 Mustangs and 1 pilot. The ratio 13-1 would become the new normal. Over the coming weeks, as Japan's resources dwindled further, those odds would rise to 20, even 30-1. The message was unmistakable. Industrial might applied with precision, and training could annihilate even the most fanatical resistance. The Empire of Japan had gambled everything on spirit. America had bet on science production and endurance. That morning over Tokyo Bay, the results were written across the sky in smoke and fire. As the morning haze over Tokyo Bay began to dissipate, the full magnitude of what had occurred sank in for both sides. For the American pilots of the 15th and 21st Fighter Groups, it was another successful mission, another step toward ending the war. For the Japanese defenders, it was the moment they understood that their air war was lost. The appearance of Mustangs so deep over the homeland was not just a tactical failure. It was the symbolic collapse of everything Imperial Japan had believed about its invulnerability. The technical disparity between the two forces was no longer measured in horsepower alone. It was visible in every small detail of flight: the smooth performance of the Mustang's supercharged Merlins compared to the strained, coughing Homar engines of the Ki-84s, the crisp coordination of VHF radio calls versus the static and silence on Japanese channels, the aerodynamic grace of the laminar flow wings slicing through the thin air where Japanese aircraft shuddered and stalled. At altitudes above 20,000 feet, the difference became lethal. The P-51D's Merlin engine, equipped with its 2-stage supercharger and intercooler system, maintained near sea-level power at those heights. Japanese engines limited to single-stage superchargers gasped for air. Their performance dropped so sharply that many pilots could no longer climb to intercept the high-flying B-29s. Some pushed their machines beyond safe limits, only to watch their engines seize or their wings fail under the stress. American pilot Lieutenant Jerry Yellen, who would later fly the last combat mission of the war, described it vividly. We'd see them climbing to meet us dark trails behind their planes as they pushed throttles to the wall. But at 25,000 feet, they were struggling just to stay aloft. We'd dive through their formations, our tracers cutting through them like sparks in a storm. They couldn't match our climb or dive. It was over before it began. The Mustang's laminar wings gave it exceptional control, even as it approached the transonic regime around 500 miles per hour in a dive. Its frame was strong enough to withstand brutal G-forces, and its control surfaces stayed responsive. Japanese fighters built with lightweight construction and lacking proper aerodynamic stiffening suffered from control reversal at high speed. The faster they dove, the less control they had. Some pilots never pulled out at all. This disparity was no accident of fate. It was the logical result of industrial evolution. America's wartime aviation industry had learned from years of iterative testing, production, feedback, and standardization. Japanese aircraft design, though innovative, could not be replicated with the same precision. Even within a single model like the Ki-84, performance varied drastically between units. One fighter might reach 420 mph, another only 360. Parts were hand-fitted, tolerances inconsistent, and substitute materials increasingly common as resources vanished. The difference extended beyond machines to men. American pilot training by 1945 was a system refined through 3 years of global war. New pilots logged 200 to 300 hours of flight instruction before advanced combat training and another 100 hours of gunnery and tactics. They trained against instructors who had fought in the European or Pacific theaters, studied enemy aircraft, and practiced deflection shooting with camera guns and live ammunition. Japanese training, in contrast, had collapsed under the strain of attrition. By 1945, the average new pilot had less than 100 flight hours, often closer to 50, and little or no experience with aerial gunnery. Ammunition shortages meant many trained only on simulators or with empty guns. Some entered combat having never fired a live round. The result was predictable formations broke apart under pressure, and attacks lacked coordination. In one analysis after the war, U.S. Army Air Force intelligence estimated that Japanese fighter pilot proficiency had fallen by nearly 80% between 1942 and 1945. Veteran instructors had been killed in the Solomons, New Guinea, and the Philippines, leaving no one to train the next generation. Those who remained fought until they died, taking their knowledge with them. Meanwhile, the Mustang pilots trained relentlessly even between missions. On Iwo Jima, they practiced formation drills, engine management, and emergency procedures daily. They were supported by an infrastructure that ensured every flight had accurate weather data, reliable instruments, and functioning navigation aids. Japan starved of fuel, and equipment could barely keep its aircraft flying, let alone maintain a robust training regime. The difference in navigation capability alone was staggering. American pilots relied on accurate maps updated from aerial reconnaissance radio beacons, and even submarines positioned as rescue stations along their routes. Lifeguard League subs equipped to recover downed airmen. Japanese pilots often flew with maps outdated by years, compasses that hadn't been calibrated, and no expectation of rescue if forced down. Many entered combat believing they would die before sunset. The psychological impact of that hopelessness eroded discipline faster than any bomb. As one captured Japanese pilot later confessed, "We flew because it was our duty, but our hearts were already dead." The Americans had everything: fuel machines, maps, training. We had our spirit, but spirit burns out when the engine stops. As the P-51s and B-29s regrouped for their return to Iwo Jima, the results of the day's mission were clear. 26 enemy aircraft destroyed for the loss of 2 Mustangs, a ratio that had become routine. The remaining Japanese fighters limped back to their airfields, many forced to land without fuel or with damaged engines. Some never made it, vanishing into the Pacific haze. In the intelligence briefings that followed, analysts noted the growing collapse of Japan's air defense network. Radar coverage was patchy communication between the Army and Navy air units, practically non-existent, and spare parts almost impossible to obtain. Even when aircraft were available, few pilots were truly combat-ready. The war in the air had become a one-sided affair, a contest between industrial civilizations where one side had already ceased to exist. Back at Iwo Jima, the returning Mustangs taxied to their hard stands, dust swirling around their landing gear. Ground crews swarmed them, checking fuel, reloading guns, and patching holes from flak. The pilots climbed down stiffly, their faces streaked with salt and exhaustion. For many, the flight had lasted more than 8 hours. 8 hours strapped into a vibrating metal cockpit, staring at endless ocean fighting fatigue and fear. Yet morale remained high-fueled by the knowledge that each mission brought them closer to ending the war. As the sun set over the Pacific that evening, the Merlin engines cooled to silence, and the men of the 7th Fighter Command gathered in the mess tent for their debriefing. They had no illusions about the dangers ahead, but they also understood, what few others yet realized, Japan's Air Force was dying in the sky, and the Mustang was the instrument delivering the final blow. By the end of that April mission, the message carried by the Mustang's contrails was unmistakable. The Pacific War had entered its final, irreversible phase. The myth of Japan's inviolable skies was shattered. What remained was a nation running on courage and fumes facing an enemy that had mastered the fusion of technology industry and logistics on a scale the world had never seen. In the following weeks, the Mustangs of Iwo Jima would return again and again, their long-range raids carving an invisible front line across the air above Japan. Each mission was a ballet of precision, 100 fighters lifting off from black volcanic runways, climbing in formation to 25,000 feet, rendezvousing with bomber streams stretching across the horizon. The roar of takeoff engines echoed against Mount Suribachi like a promise. We will come back until it's over. These missions, called VLRs. Very long-range operations tested the limits of both man and machine. Pilots spent 8 or more hours in cramped cockpits, their legs going numb, their eyes burning from the constant glare. They had to manage fuel down to the gallon, constantly calculating wind drift and altitude to ensure they could make the 1,500-mile round trip. Every turn of the propeller was a balance between range and survival. On paper, it was mathematics. Gallons of fuel, miles per hour, pounds of ammunition. But in practice, it was a feat of willpower. Major Tapp once said in an interview after the war, "Fighting the Japanese was hard. Fighting exhaustion cold and the ocean beneath you for 8 straight hours was harder." The Mustangs were built for endurance, but not comfort. Pilots sat wedged into narrow aluminum seats, lined with thin padding, strapped so tightly they could barely move. Relief tubes often froze at altitude, and oxygen masks bit into their skin. They ate chocolate bars and chewed gum to stay awake. Many emerged from missions with deep pressure marks on their faces, their bodies stiff, dehydrated, and trembling from adrenaline. Yet when the call came, they flew again the next morning. The Japanese pilots who met them in the skies over Honshu faced the same cold and fatigue, but with machines and logistics that betrayed them at every step. By mid-1945, the Ki-84 Hayate had become a symbol of potential unrealized. Its theoretical performance rivaled the Mustang, but its real-world record told a different story. Each one depended on engines whose reliability was measured not in hours, but in flights, 2, maybe 3, before major maintenance was needed, and the maintenance crews were gone drafted or dead. Reports from captured Japanese documents after the war revealed the extent of the disaster. Steel impurities from rushed heat treatment caused landing gear failures. Replacement engine pistons warped at altitude. Electrical systems shorted under humidity because of poor insulation. The brilliant engineers who had once built world-class aircraft like the Zero could only watch as their designs were destroyed by inferior materials and exhausted laborers working under candlelight amid bombed-out factories. Even the fuel that powered these fighters told the story of collapse. Japan's dwindling petroleum supply forced chemists to synthesize aviation fuel from pine roots, a process that required 200 tree stumps to produce 1 gallon of low-grade fuel. The result was a volatile, inconsistent mixture that fouled spark plugs and caused pre-ignition. Some engines exploded before takeoff. Others lost power in midair, forcing pilots to glide back toward airfields that no longer had spare parts or functioning control towers. American pilots, on the other hand, trusted every component of their machines. Their instruments worked. Their guns rarely jammed. Their radios allowed real-time coordination with bombers and other squadrons. When a Mustang's engine failed, a rare event, submarines and rescue planes were waiting along the return route. This safety net, invisible but ever-present, gave American pilots the confidence to push their planes harder and fly farther. This was more than tactical advantage. It was psychological warfare. Every successful VLR mission eroded Japan's morale, not only in its military ranks, but among its civilians. Farmers and factory workers who once cheered the skyward flight of Japanese interceptors now stared in disbelief at silver Mustangs streaking overhead. The sight of foreign fighters over Tokyo strafing airfields and diving through clouds above the emperor's palace carried a message even propaganda couldn't bury. The war was no longer at the frontier. It was here. Captain Harry Krim Jr. of the 531st Fighter Squadron remembered flying low over Tokyo Bay on one such mission. We could see ships burning trains, derailed airfields smoking. The Japanese had nothing left that could reach us. It felt like flying over a ghost. His words captured the chilling efficiency of the Allied campaign, not vindictive, but clinical. The Mustangs had become tools of inevitability, dismantling what was left of Japan's defense system, one sortie at a time. Japanese officers understood this as well. A diary recovered from a Ki-84 squadron leader reads, "We cannot stop them. The Mustang comes and goes as it pleases. Our planes fall apart. Our engines cough like old men. We fly knowing our death changes nothing." That resignation, more than any bomb, marked the true defeat of Japan's air arm. By June, attrition had taken its final toll. The 47th and 244th Sentai once elite fighter units were reduced to scattered survivors. Training flights were canceled for lack of fuel. New recruits received mere hours of flight time. The Imperial Command ordered kamikaze tactics not out of fanaticism alone, but because conventional air combat was no longer possible. Meanwhile, the Mustangs grew bolder. They no longer confined themselves to escorting bombers. They began conducting low-level strafing runs on train ships and even convoys moving through Tokyo's suburbs. The precision of these attacks shocked Japanese observers. One engineer in Yokohama later wrote, "They flew so low I could see the pilot's face. He fired only when he had a clear shot. Every burst found its mark." The mastery of technology training and production had fused into a kind of mechanized art form, an orchestra of war where every note was calculated. And behind it all, in American factories thousands of miles away, the music never stopped. Engines rolled off assembly lines every hour, ammunition belts every minute. Liberty ships crossed the Pacific like a steel tide. What Japan faced now was not just defeat on the battlefield, but annihilation through arithmetic, the relentless multiplication of industrial capacity applied to destruction. Each day, the skies grew more crowded with bombers and the defenders fewer. The age of the samurai in the sky was ending. The age of the assembly line had taken its place. By July 1945, Japan's air defense was little more than a shadow, a scattering of units clinging to duty as the industrial lifeblood of the empire evaporated. The raids that began as cautious experiments in long-range escort had transformed into daily spectacles of dominance. The Mustangs owned the skies, and with that ownership came a terrifying freedom. They could go anywhere, strike anything, and return untouched. From Iwo Jima, missions launched in waves. One group would escort B-29s targeting industrial hubs in Nagoya or Osaka. Another would sweep ahead to strafe airfields and rail lines. The coordination was extraordinary. Weather reconnaissance flights left hours before dawn. Their reports transmitted back to operations planners who drew complex routes designed to avoid storms and maximize tailwinds. Even the rescue submarines, the so-called Lifeguard League, moved in synchronization, surfacing at predetermined coordinates beneath the expected flight path. The Japanese tried to adapt. They built decoy airfields dotted with wooden aircraft painted to deceive Allied photo reconnaissance. They carved new runways into valleys and camouflaged them with nets. Some engineers proposed using tethered balloons and ground-fired rockets as last-ditch defenses. None of it mattered. The Mustangs, equipped with high-resolution cameras and guided by meticulous intelligence, could tell the difference between a wooden dummy and a real aircraft from 20,000 feet. What truly defeated Japan's air arm, however, was mathematics. American manufacturing and fuel logistics were producing results on a scale that no nation in history had ever achieved. Liberty ships unloaded thousands of tons of supplies every week at Iwo Jima. Fuel tankers pumped 100-octane aviation gasoline directly into underground bladders, ensuring every Mustang could launch daily. Replacement aircraft arrived almost as fast as attrition took them. For Japan, every sortie was a gamble with dwindling chips. Engineers were forced to reuse damaged parts and fabricate replacements by hand. A single factory bombing could erase an entire month's output. The once vaunted Nakajima and Mitsubishi plants were running at a fraction of capacity, their roofs ripped open by incendiary raids. The result was mechanical roulette. One Hayate might perform brilliantly, climbing and turning like its designers intended. The next, built from substandard steel and warped propeller blades, might barely reach combat altitude before its engine seized. Pilots called them lucky and unlucky planes, an admission that chance had replaced engineering. American engineers had eliminated luck from the equation. The Mustang's design was standardized to microscopic tolerances. Every bolt panel and rivet fit the same way on every airframe. Maintenance manuals were precise to the tenth of an inch. That predictability meant that ground crews could swap engines' wings or control surfaces between aircraft without adjustment. It also meant that pilots could step into any P-51 and know exactly how it would handle. This uniformity extended beyond hardware to doctrine. American squadrons operated under flexible yet consistent tactics. Finger four formations allowed pilots to maintain visibility and mutual support. Each element could act autonomously, yet remain part of the group's coordinated attack. Radio discipline was strict, short, clear commands, no wasted chatter. When they encountered opposition, each Mustang pilot knew precisely what his wingman would do. Japanese formations, still based on pre-war three-ship tactics, disintegrated under pressure. Without functioning radios or shared doctrine, individual pilots fought isolated duels. The courage was there, no one doubted that, but courage alone could not rebuild a broken network. Down below, the B-29s delivered their payloads with increasing accuracy. The Mustang's presence ensured daylight bombing could continue without devastating losses. Whole sections of Tokyo, Osaka, and Yokohama burned night and day. Industrial capacity fell faster than ever predicted. Even the Imperial General Headquarters began to concede that there was no path left to recovery. To the men flying the VLR missions, these victories came at a steep cost of endurance. Major Tapp's unit, logged hundreds of hours over open ocean battling weather systems that could kill without a single enemy shot fired. On June 1, 1945, the infamous Black Friday 27th Mustangs vanished into a storm off Osaka, victims of turbulence and lightning. 24 of those losses were attributed to weather alone. Pilots described glowing static crawling along their wings' compasses, spinning wildly, instruments freezing. It was a grim reminder that even technological mastery could not conquer nature entirely, yet the missions continued. Each loss was met with replacement aircraft within days. Each missing pilot was replaced by another, trained in the vast pipeline that stretched from Texas airfields to Pacific outposts. The industrial machine behind the Mustang was relentless. By contrast, Japan's pilot training system had collapsed entirely. Without fuel, new cadets sat in classrooms instead of cockpits. Many were sent into combat after only 50 hours of flight time, less than the weekly average of an American trainee. In desperation, teenage boys were conscripted into suicide units, taught only to take off point their aircraft at an enemy ship and die. As the weeks passed, Mustang pilots reported fewer dogfights and more empty skies. The remaining Japanese fighters seldom challenged the bombers directly. Instead, they lingered around airfields or attempted kamikaze dives at shipping convoys, gestures of defiance rather than strategy. The balance of air power was so absolute that even the weather could not disguise its futility. When storms cleared over Honshu, the Mustangs reappeared like clockwork, cutting contrails across the sky. Civilians called them the silver birds of doom. Children learned to identify their silhouettes long before they ever saw a Japanese interceptor again. By mid-July, the Mustang had become more than a weapon. It was a symbol. It represented the triumph of system over spontaneity, of engineering over tradition. It embodied the new arithmetic of modern war, where output, logistics, and precision decided destiny long before the battle began. In that arithmetic, Japan's numbers were running out. By late July 1945, the Imperial Japanese Army Air Service was barely a functioning force. Squadrons that had once fielded dozens of aircraft were now reduced to a handful of machines guarded by overworked ground crews and nervous young pilots. Across the airfields of Honshu and Kyushu, lines of derelict Hayates and Heians sat with flat tires and empty fuel tanks, their aluminum skins pitted and dulled by weeks of neglect. The air was heavy with the smell of decay and resignation. Mechanics cannibalized wrecks to keep a few fighters running, scavenging engines, tires, and even seat harnesses. Pilots wrote farewell letters they might never send, knowing every sortie could be their last. Yet even amid exhaustion and despair, they still took off when the siren sounded. The Mustangs came in waves. Their long contrails traced the sky like lines on a map, lines that led inevitably to Japan's defeat. Missions now combined escort reconnaissance and ground attack in seamless coordination. While the B-29s burned Japan's industrial cities, the Mustangs destroyed what little infrastructure kept the country moving. They strafed trains, ferries, and communication lines, leaving destruction in their wake but sparing civilians whenever possible. The precision of their strikes reflected not just technological superiority, but discipline, a sharp contrast to the chaos below. Reports from the Japanese Home Ministry paint a grim picture. Entire regions lost power for days as transformer stations were hit. Supply trains carrying food and fuel vanished under waves of gunfire. In cities like Osaka and Yokohama, residents learned to dive for cover at the first whine of Merlin engines. The war had moved from the frontiers to the neighborhoods, and yet the irony of technological warfare was clear to those who flew it. The same American pilots who unleashed destruction over Japan often felt no joy, only fatigue. Major James Tapp later wrote, "We weren't heroes. We were workers with wings. Every sortie was another shift. You did your job, came home, ate, and did it again." The industrial scale of war had turned courage into routine. The logistics behind these missions defied imagination. On Iwo Jima, an island just 8 miles wide, U.S. forces maintained one of the most complex aviation networks ever built. Massive fuel farms pumped aviation gasoline through underground pipelines to each airstrip. Repair tents lit through the night-serviced engines that ran thousands of miles between overhauls. Mobile cranes lifted damaged Mustangs onto flatbeds where crews swapped engines in less than 4 hours. Each evening, cargo ships anchored offshore delivered new ammunition, spare parts, and mail from home. The system was self-sustaining, unstoppable. The Japanese could only watch this rhythm and despair. Their remaining airfields, battered by bombs and deprived of supplies, looked more like graveyards than bases. Even the elite 244th Sentai, once stationed to defend Tokyo, was down to a few serviceable aircraft. The rest were grounded, stripped for metal to repair others. On some days, pilots shared aircraft, one flying a morning sortie, another in the afternoon, both risking their lives in machines patched together with scrap. In those final weeks, the Japanese military doctrine shifted from defense to sacrifice. The idea of the kamikaze had evolved from desperation into necessity. With no fuel, no replacements, and no realistic hope of victory, the command ordered pilots to ram Allied ships or bombers. The logic was cruel but simple. If you cannot outfight the enemy, you can at least terrify him. Yet even this strategy faltered. The Mustangs patrolled the skies so effectively that many kamikaze aircraft were destroyed before reaching their targets. The psychological gap between the two sides was now enormous. American pilots flew, knowing that if shot down, rescue submarines or Dumbo seaplanes would come for them. Japanese pilots flew, knowing that rescue was impossible, that the sea beneath them was their grave. The difference between those expectations shaped every decision in the air. One side measured risk. The other embraced death. By August 1945, the Mustangs had expanded their missions beyond escort and strike. They now served as forward observers for naval bombardments, photo reconnaissance scouts for B-29 raids, and even air-sea rescue coordinators. The versatility of the P-51D made it a flying command center. Its long range and reliability allowed it to map weather systems and report enemy ship movements across thousands of miles. No other single-engine aircraft in the world could have performed such diverse tasks. At the same time, the toll on pilots mounted. The average mission time stretched to 8 or 9 hours. Fatigue, dehydration, and hypoxia became constant companions. Many developed chronic back pain from sitting motionless for so long. A few suffered frostbite despite heated suits that often malfunctioned. The strain was invisible but immense, and yet morale held. The pilots of the Sunsetters, as the Iwo Jima Mustang groups were called, took pride in their role as the spear tip of victory. Lieutenant Jerry Yellen later reflected on the paradox of that pride. We were young and thought we were invincible. But when we saw Japan burning beneath us, we knew we were watching the end of a civilization. It wasn't triumph. We felt it was sadness that it had to come to this. That sadness did not stop the missions. The system was in motion, a machine too vast to pause. Each successful raid paved the way for the next, each destroyed airfield, another guarantee that the Japanese sky belonged to America. As General Ernest M. Moore of the 7th Fighter Command later summarized, by July, we no longer fought for air superiority. We had it. We were fighting to keep the pressure constant, to remind Japan that resistance was no longer an option. By the first week of August, the Japanese mainland lay defenseless. Communication intercepts confirmed that the remaining fighter units had less than 200,000 gallons of fuel nationwide, enough for one more major operation at best. Meanwhile, the Americans were delivering millions of gallons a month across the Pacific. The The comparison wasn't just unfair, it was apocalyptic. When Hiroshima was bombed on August 6th, not a single Japanese interceptor rose to challenge the Enola Gay. There were none left that could. The Mustangs that had once escorted B-29s across the ocean no longer needed to fly that day. Their earlier victories had already secured the sky. In the cold arithmetic of war, the equation had been solved long before the atomic age dawned. August 1945, the final month of the war in the Pacific. Japan's skies were silent now, but not because peace had arrived. Silence was simply all that remained. The roar of engines that once filled the air over Tokyo had faded into distant echoes of loss. The Mustangs of the 7th Fighter Command still flew, but their missions were less about combat and more about confirmation there was no enemy left to fight. When the first P-51 formations took off from Iwo Jima in early August, their briefings no longer centered on dogfights or escorts. Instead, their orders read, "Search, identify, and destroy any remaining signs of resistance." Some squadrons were tasked with photographing airfields to confirm their destruction. Others scouted shipping lanes where no ships sailed. Each sortie documented a vanished empire. From the cockpit of a Mustang, Japan appeared ghost-like cities, flattened rail lines, twisted factories, silent. Smoke still rose from the ruins of Yokohama and Kobe. Roads were clogged, not with troops, but with refugees wandering aimlessly through the destruction. What had once been a proud industrial nation was now a landscape of ash and resignation. On August 10th, the 15th and 56th fighter groups engaged what would be one of the last recorded aerial battles of the Second World War. 7 Japanese aircraft were destroyed near Tokyo, mostly obsolete Ki-43s and Ki-61s flown by barely trained replacements. It wasn't a battle so much as a coda, the final movement of a long and tragic symphony. American pilots returned to Iwo Jima with few words spoken. They knew what it meant the war was ending not with glory, but exhaustion. The statistics were staggering. Between April and August 1945, the Iwo Jima Mustangs shot down over 200 Japanese aircraft, roughly 3/4 of all P-51 aerial victories in the Pacific. Yet those numbers told only part of the story. Most Japanese losses were not in air-to-air combat, but on the ground destroyed by strafing runs that turned airfields into graveyards. The rest were victims of mechanical failure or fuel starvation. Japan's air power had not been defeated, it had been erased. The P-51 had become the embodiment of what military historians would later call the arithmetic of modern warfare. It wasn't just faster, or deadlier, or better engineered. It was sustainable. Every Mustang lost could be replaced within days. Every bullet fired could be resupplied within hours. Every pilot killed had a trained replacement waiting on another airfield halfway across the Pacific. Japan could no longer replicate even one of those conditions. To the men flying these final missions, victory felt strangely hollow. Lieutenant Colonel John R. Morgan, a reconnaissance pilot with the 457th Squadron, described flying over central Honshu after the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. "We saw no fighters, no flak, just silence. It was like flying over another planet. The only movement below was smoke drifting from cities that no longer existed." He and his crew reported dozens of derelict aircraft scattered across fields' airframes without engines, fake wooden planes painted to deceive reconnaissance, and skeletons of factories where workers had once built Japan's finest machines. The deception was obvious, but so was the desperation. American intelligence confirmed that of the roughly 3,500 Ki-84 Hayats ever produced, fewer than half had reached combat units, and only a few dozen were operational by the war's final month. In contrast, over 15,000 P-51s of all variants had rolled off American assembly lines identical and interchangeable. Each represented not just an aircraft, but a philosophy that quantity and quality could coexist when a nation's industrial heart beat in unison. The Mustang's reliability turned it into a multi-role weapon, even as the war wound down. It could escort bombers one day, strafe airfields the next, and fly reconnaissance the day after. It could operate from coral strips, endure salt corrosion, and fly multiple sorties a day. No other aircraft, Allied or Axis, matched that versatility. Even the mighty Spitfire, a symbol of British air power, could not have flown from Iwo Jima to Tokyo and back. Yet behind the technological triumph lay a sobering truth: the pilots themselves were being consumed by the pace of victory. The Sunsetters, once 700 strong, were reduced by attrition fatigue and mental strain. Some men broke down from the monotony of endless missions. Others simply vanished into storms over the ocean. Between July 1st and August 15th, 85 American fighter pilots died not in combat, but from weather mechanical failure or exhaustion. When Japan finally announced its surrender on August 15th, the Mustangs were already airborne. Lieutenant Jerry Yellen and his wingman 19-year-old Second Lieutenant Philip Schlamberg were flying a routine ground attack mission near Nagoya. The message to stand down the code word Utah never reached them. They dove on an airfield, strafed a line of parked aircraft, and turned for home. Yellen emerged from a cloud bank alone. Schlamberg's plane never appeared again. He became the last American pilot killed in combat during World War II. That moment, so ordinary, so tragic, encapsulated the brutal arithmetic of war. Even in the final minutes, the machinery of destruction kept turning blind to politics or surrender. The P-51s that had ruled the skies finished their mission as they began it, efficient, relentless, and obedient to orders. In the weeks that followed, the surviving Mustangs flew mercy missions, dropping food and supplies to Allied POWs held across Japan and its former territories. The same planes that had carried death now delivered hope. Major Tapp himself participated in these flights, later writing, "We came full circle from destroyers to deliverers." The same wings that broke Japan's resistance were now carrying its redemption. When the occupation began, American officers toured the wreckage of Japan's air industry. At the Nakajima Musashino plant, once capable of producing hundreds of fighters a month, they found only collapsed hangars, rusted machine tools, and assembly lines buried in rubble. Among the ruins sat a single surviving Ki-84 airframe, riddled with bullet holes, but still bearing the rising sun on its fuselage. That plane would later be restored and displayed in the Chiran Peace Museum in Kagoshima, the last of its kind. Meanwhile, hundreds of P-51Ds returned home. Some were scrapped. Others became air racers or museum pieces. Many, astonishingly, still fly today, their Merlin engines echoing the sound that once marked the end of an empire. For historians, the shock Japan's pilots felt at seeing Mustangs over Tokyo was more than military surprise. It was the moment an old world gave way to a new one, the instant when industrial warfare proved that courage and tradition, no matter how noble, could not stand against organization and innovation. The P-51D over Mount Fuji was not merely an airplane. It was the symbol of a civilization that had learned how to turn science into dominance, and ultimately dominance into peace. In the days immediately following Japan's surrender, the skies over the Pacific transformed from arenas of violence to corridors of quiet transition. The same Mustangs that had once escorted bombers and strafed railways now flew with their guns unloaded, carrying messages, supplies, and a strange new purpose. The war was over, but for many pilots, the habit of vigilance remained. They scanned the horizon out of instinct, expecting an enemy that would never again appear. For the Japanese people, those silver aircraft overhead no longer represented death, but the beginning of an uncertain peace. From the ashes of Tokyo's fire-bombed districts to the rural villages that had escaped direct attack, The sight of an American P-51 gliding silently across the morning sky symbolized both defeat and survival. The weapon that had ended their war now traced the outline of their reconstruction. On Iwo Jima, the Mustang squadrons continued flying long after the fighting had ceased. They photographed the ruins of Japan's airfields for Allied intelligence, escorted cargo planes ferrying occupation forces, and patrolled the sea lanes to locate downed airmen. Engineers built makeshift maintenance hangars out of canvas and steel tubing, keeping the aircraft operational in the tropical humidity. Mechanics who had once worked through nights of battle now repaired engines for routine flights, their wrenches echoing in the still air that had replaced the roar of war. The transformation from warrior to custodian was gradual but profound. Major James Tapp, the man who had led the first Mustang mission over Tokyo, now oversaw logistical flights delivering medical supplies to POW camps. Pilots who had memorized bombing coordinates now memorized relief routes. We had trained to destroy, one of them later recalled, and suddenly we were asked to preserve. It felt strange, but it felt right. In the cities below, Japan's airfields became symbols of surrender. At Atsugi, where American forces first landed to accept Japan's capitulation, rows of captured aircraft sat abandoned on the tarmac. Zero's Hayates Shidens stripped of fuel and weapons. Some bore bullet scars, others the faded insignia of units long since destroyed. When the first Mustangs landed beside them, the contrast was stark. The technological chasm that had determined the war's outcome now sat in plain sight, metal beside metal, like the fossils of two eras. For the American pilots, the experience was bittersweet. They walked among the wrecks, studying enemy fighters that they had only ever seen through gun sights. Many expressed a kind of awe, even respect for their former opponents. The Ki-84 Hayate in particular drew admiration, a beautiful machine crippled by circumstance. One Mustang pilot traced his hand over the bullet holes in its fuselage and said softly, "If they'd had the steel we did, it might have been a fair fight." The war's end also brought reflection on the nature of air power itself. The Mustang's triumph was not only a testament to design, but to an industrial system capable of feeding that design with infinite resources. It had proven that war in the modern age would be decided less by bravery than by the capacity to manufacture, transport, and sustain. Economists and strategists studying the campaign over Japan later called it the proof of total logistics, the demonstration that a nation's factory floor could project power across oceans as effectively as an army. Historians noted another truth as well, the moral burden of such dominance. The devastation of Japan's cities, the loss of civilian life, and the psychological impact of seeing a once imperial capital brought to ruin haunted many of those who had taken part. Major Tapp himself years later wrote that he sometimes dreamed of Mount Fuji, not as a navigation beacon, but as a silent witness to everything humanity was capable of, both magnificent and terrible. As occupation forces consolidated control, the Mustangs began to fade from the Pacific theater. New technologies were already emerging, jet aircraft that would soon redefine speed and altitude. The age of the propeller was ending just as surely as the age of the samurai had. Yet the legacy of the P-51 endured not only in museums and air shows, but in doctrine. Every jet fighter that followed inherited its principles, range, reliability, and the balance between agility and endurance. Japan, meanwhile, began to rebuild under Allied supervision. Engineers who had once designed fighters turned their talents to civilian aviation. Airfields once used for war became hubs for commerce and communication. The very same runways that had launched attacks on American bombers now saw the first post-war flights carrying food, medical aid, and the tools of reconstruction. The air that had been a battlefield became a bridge. For the Japanese pilots who survived, peace was both a relief and a reckoning. Some became engineers or instructors in the new Japan Self-Defense Force. Others never flew again. One former Hayate pilot interviewed decades later said, "When I first saw a Mustang again at an air show, I thought of the friends we lost. Then I realized that its sound, that deep Merlin roar, meant we had survived to hear it." The P-51 itself outlived the war by decades. It served in Korea, in the Middle East, and even as a training platform well into the 1960s. Its elegant silhouette became a symbol of victory in museums and documentaries, but also a reminder of the cost of progress. In Japan, the lone surviving Ki-84 Hayate, preserved at Chiran, stands as its counterpart, a relic of courage caught in the machinery of history. When historians today speak of the shock of the Mustangs over Tokyo, they are describing more than a military surprise. They are describing the moment when human imagination and industrial power collided, creating a new kind of warfare that rendered distance isolation and even courage obsolete. It was the dawn of an era in which the outcome of wars would be written not only in the skies, but in the factories, laboratories, and assembly lines that fed them. The Mustang's flight over Mount Fuji symbolized that transformation. It was the moment when the industrial heartbeat of one nation drowned out the imperial drum of another. And as their engines roared across the sky that day in April 1945, they carried with them a lesson that would define the modern world in the age of machines. Mastery belongs not just to those who fight, but to those who can build without ceasing. The world that emerged after 1945 was built on the lessons written in those skies. The P-51 Mustang, sleek and unyielding, became more than a weapon. It was a symbol of what modern industry could accomplish when focused on a single total purpose. Its wings carried not just fuel and firepower, but a blueprint for the century ahead. In the early years of peace, the veterans who had flown the Mustangs dispersed back into civilian life. Some returned to farms and universities, others stayed in the service to train a new generation of jet pilots. They were young men aged by war, their faces still marked by the leather straps of oxygen masks, their hearing dulled by the thunder of Merlin engines. For them, the sudden stillness of peacetime was unsettling. They had lived in constant motion, now the horizon no longer required conquering. Yet they understood that they had witnessed the turning of an epoch. The P-51 had proven that technology, logistics, and production lines could replace empires, that the future would belong to whoever mastered coordination on a global scale. The new era of jet propulsion, electronics, and nuclear power would grow from that foundation. America's manufacturing capacity, refined in wartime, pivoted effortlessly to consumer production cars, televisions, and aircraft for civilian travel. The same assembly lines that once built fighters now built the peace. Japan, too, transformed. Its engineers, once devoted to aircraft that could never outfly their enemies, redirected their precision to rebuilding a nation from ashes. The irony of history was unmistakable. The industrial philosophy that had defeated Japan would soon be adopted by it. Within a generation, Japanese factories would produce cars and electronics that rivaled and even surpassed their former conquerors. The lesson of standardization, of refinement through repetition, had been learned from defeat. Still, for those who had lived through it, memory was inescapable. Pilots on both sides carried the same ghosts, not of enemies, but of the thin line between mastery and madness. Many American aviators admitted that the sight of burning cities haunted them long after victory parades had faded. They had seen what unlimited production and precision could achieve, and they wondered if humanity could survive its own efficiency. Major Tapp, interviewed years later, said quietly, "We didn't think about the philosophy of it then. We were told to end the war, and we did. But when you see a whole nation's sky empty, when there's no one left to fight you, That's not triumph. That's the sound of silence you never forget. Historians would later describe that silence as the defining sound of modern warfare. It was not the chaos of battle, but the absence of opposition, the moment when industrial superiority had removed all doubt from war. The P-51's legacy lived on not only in its victories, but in the moral questions it raised. Could such power ever again be used without destroying everything it touched? In 1947, a handful of Mustangs were kept operational in Japan under the Allied occupation. Their pilots flew reconnaissance over the rebuilding cities, photographing the progress of reconstruction. Those images, once used for targeting, now documented rebirth. The contrast was staggering. Airfields once filled with wreckage were repaved for civilian transport. Factories once devoted to death now produced rail engines and construction materials. The Japanese people began to look upward again, not in fear, but curiosity. For children who had grown up under the roar of bombers, the sound of a single propeller became a story told by their parents, a relic of a vanished world. Some of those same children would later design aircraft themselves, inspired by both the grace and terror of the machines they had seen. By the 1950s, the P-51 had been eclipsed by the jet age, yet its silhouette endured as a kind of monument. Air museums displayed it not as an artifact of destruction, but as a symbol of human ingenuity, the perfection of form meeting function. Engineers studied its laminar flow wings and cooling systems as lessons in aerodynamic balance. Even today, pilots who fly restored Mustangs describe the same thrill, a feeling of connection to an era when flight decided the fate of nations. One surviving Japanese pilot interviewed in the 1970s beside the preserved Ki-84 at Chiran summed it up with quiet reverence. When we first saw the Mustangs over Tokyo, we thought it was the end of the world. But perhaps it was only the end of an old one. They showed us what the future would look like, and we learned. The world did learn. The conflict between the Mustang and the Hayate marked the closing of a millennium of warrior myth and the beginning of a mechanized age where precision science and systems ruled. It was the moment when history left behind the romantic image of the lone swordsman and replaced it with the engineer, the mechanic, and the production planner. The shock of those first Mustangs over Tokyo was therefore more than a moment of military astonishment. It was civilization looking in the mirror and seeing what it had become. Beneath their polished wings lay not just the triumph of one nation, but the awakening of a world entering the age of machines. The echo of those engines over Mount Fuji still lingers, a reminder that power once unleashed can change not just wars, but the very definition of humanity's reach. Decades after that first April morning when Mustangs appeared over Tokyo, their legend still lingered in the minds of those who saw them as warriors, witnesses, or victims. What began as a moment of shock had become a metaphor for an age, the intersection of courage, machinery, and inevitability. The P-51D Mustang, born in the factories of California and refined in the laboratories of two continents, stood as a monument to what happens when human imagination weds industrial discipline. In the post-war decades, the aircraft itself aged gracefully into myth. In air shows across the world, restored Mustangs still roared to life, their Merlin engines shaking the ground, their polished fuselages reflecting sunlight like liquid metal. Crowds who had never known war heard that sound and felt something primal, the hum of technology at the edge of art. The machine that had once conquered the skies over Japan now symbolized not destruction, but mastery. In Japan, the contrast was profound. The ruins of the empire became classrooms for a new generation of engineers. The lessons of the war were studied not through propaganda, but through science, airflow, metallurgy, and production logistics. The nation that had once struggled to produce a handful of high-performance fighters would within a few decades build world-leading aircraft components, automobiles, and electronics. The post-war economic miracle was in many ways the long echo of the Mustang's shadow proof that defeat, when fully understood, could become the blueprint for transformation. Historians later wrote that the P-51D had done more than escort bombers or win dogfights. It had ended the concept of isolation. No island, no ocean, no distance was beyond reach anymore. The oceans that had once protected nations had become highways for machines. The doctrine of range had rewritten global strategy. Whoever could project power the farthest would shape the world that followed. In that sense, every jet fighter, every intercontinental bomber, and even every spacecraft that came later traced its lineage back to the P-51's long flight from Iwo Jima to Tokyo. Yet amid the triumph of technology, the human dimension endured. The surviving pilots of both sides aged into quiet men who rarely spoke of the war. When they did, their words carried a tone of reconciliation rather than victory. American veterans often expressed admiration for their Japanese counterparts, recognizing the same discipline and courage mirrored in the enemy's cockpit. Former Japanese pilots, many of whom went on to design civil aircraft or teach aeronautical engineering, spoke of the Mustang not with resentment, but with respect. It showed us how far humanity could reach when it decides to fly with purpose, one said. As decades passed, the industrial age that had produced the Mustang gave way to the digital one, yet the aircraft retained its aura. Museums preserved it not as a relic of violence, but as a symbol of the 20th century's contradictions: elegance fused with efficiency, beauty married to destruction. Every polished rivet and aerodynamic curve whispered of a time when nations built perfection to survive, and survival demanded perfection. The lone Ki-84 at Chiran remained equally important, standing in silent dialogue with its rival across oceans and decades. Together they formed a pair of memorials, one to the speed of progress, the other to the fragility of ambition. Visitors who walked between them sensed the same truth. History is not written only by victors, but by engineers, workers, and dreamers who push beyond limits without knowing the cost. In aerial museums from Duxford to Dayton, the sound of the Mustang's engine still draws crowds. Children cover their ears, then laugh as the noise fades into the distance. They do not know that the same thunder once rolled across Mount Fuji in 1945, marking the end of one world and the beginning of another. What those children see is not war, but wonder, the wonder of human creation soaring against gravity and time. That transformation from fear to fascination may be the Mustang's greatest legacy. It began as an instrument of total war and ended as an ambassador of remembrance, proof that even the tools of destruction can in peace remind humanity of its potential to build, to imagine, to transcend. The Japanese pilots who first saw the Mustangs over Tokyo believed they were witnessing the death of their world. They were right, but not in the way they thought. What ended that day was an age of isolation, of limited reach, of warfare bound by geography. What began was the era of global connection, an era where innovation could both destroy and unite. The shock of the Mustangs was ultimately the shock of progress itself, swift, unstoppable, and irreversible. From those silver wings came a truth that still defines the modern world, that power, when harnessed by imagination, can change not just battles, but civilization itself. Time has a way of softening even the sharpest echoes of war. 8 decades after the Mustangs first crossed the skies of Tokyo, their legend remains, not only in museums or history books, but in the moral imagination of the world that followed. The story of those flights of the men who flew them and the empire that faced them became something larger than strategy or engineering. It became a parable about the price of progress, a mirror held up to the 20th century itself. Today, When aviation historians speak of the P-51D Mustang, they speak less about its speed or climb rate than about what it represented: the absolute culmination of an industrial civilization at its zenith. It was a machine that fused human instinct with mechanical precision, courage with mass production. No other symbol of the Second World War so perfectly captured the paradox of human ingenuity, our capacity to create beauty in the pursuit of destruction. In the decades that followed, that paradox shaped everything. The post-war world rebuilt under the shadow of the atom, and the jet was one born from the same logic that had built the Mustang, the belief that innovation could conquer any obstacle. Nations learned to measure power not just in armies but in production capacity, in research budgets, in the coordination of science and industry. The age of global competition, of space races, technological revolutions, and digital frontiers all began with that first lesson of range and reach. Japan's own rebirth illustrated this truth better than any victory parade could. The factories that had once produced warplanes became the foundation of an industrial renaissance. Engineers retooled assembly lines to make motorcycles, then cars, then electronics. Within a generation, Japan had become a technological power whose products circled the globe: cameras, transistors, microchips. The same meticulous discipline that had once crafted fighters for battle now built devices for peace. American veterans watched this transformation with a mixture of pride and amazement. Some returned to Japan in the 1960s and 1970s as businessmen or consultants walking through the same cities they had once bombed. They found not resentment, but cooperation. The two nations that had waged total war in the skies now collaborated in science, trade, and culture. What had once been an arena of fire became a partnership in creation. The surviving Mustangs, restored and gleaming, became ambassadors of that shared memory. Their airframes still bore the scars of battle-faint pockmarks under the paint rivets replaced with care, but they flew now only for remembrance. Each time one took to the air, veterans and civilians alike felt the resonance of history. The deep rumble of its Merlin engine spoke not of conquest, but of continuity, a reminder that progress, however terrible its birth, can still yield meaning. As the 21st century unfolded, the Mustang's silhouette remained instantly recognizable: the long nose, the bubble canopy, the swept tail. Designers of modern aircraft, from stealth fighters to hypersonic drones, still studied its form. The principles that had guided its creation, efficiency, balance, endurance, were eternal. And in that sense, the Mustang's lineage never truly ended. It simply evolved into new shapes, new speeds, new frontiers. Yet for all its technical brilliance, what endures most about the Mustang's story is its humanity. It is the memory of young men, American and Japanese alike, who took to the sky believing in causes greater than themselves, only to discover that technology would outlast ideology. They were the last generation to fight a global war defined by propellers, and the first to glimpse a future defined by machines beyond imagination. Major James Tapp passed away in 1999, his medals neatly framed beside a model of his old P-51 Sunsetter. In his final interview, he was asked what he felt when he looked back on those missions over Tokyo. His answer was simple: "We didn't fly to kill a nation. We flew to end a nightmare." And when it was over, the hardest part was realizing how much the world had changed while we were still in the air. Those words captured the essence of the Mustang's legacy. It was not only a tool of victory, but a witness to transformation the moment humanity stepped irreversibly into the modern age. From the ruins of that war rose a global network of trade, communication, and innovation that connected the once isolated islands of the Pacific to every corner of the Earth. The same air routes pioneered by combat squadrons became the arteries of commerce. The same runways that launched bombers now launched passenger jets. What had begun as conquest ended as connection. The Mustang's roar over Tokyo was, in hindsight, not merely the sound of dominance, it was the overture to globalization. The machine that crossed 750 miles of ocean to strike an empire proved that distance itself was no longer a defense. And in that realization, the world was forever altered. Today, as visitors stand before the surviving P-51s in hangars and museums, they often notice the small details, the worn grips on the control stick, the faded stenciling on the fuselage. It is easy to forget that these were not mythic weapons, but human creations born from hands and hearts, driven by fear, duty, and hope. The Mustang is both the beauty and burden of progress, made visible, and somewhere in the silence between its propeller's distant echoes lies the enduring truth of that April morning in 1945, that technology once unleashed does not merely change how we fight, it changes who we are. 80 years on the story of the P-51 Mustang still circles the collective memory of humankind, like one of its own long escort arcs, always returning to the same question. How did a single machine come to symbolize both the height of our brilliance and the weight of our conscience? The Mustang was never just metal and rivets. It was a reflection of the people who built it. The factory workers in Los Angeles and Dallas. The engineers hunched over drafting tables. The mechanics who learned to replace a Merlin engine by touch in the dark. The pilots who trusted that engine with their lives. It was in every sense the distilled essence of a civilization that believed in the power of its own creation. When those silver fighters first appeared over Tokyo, they carried more than ammunition. They carried an idea that distance and isolation had lost their power. From that day forward, no nation could ever again rely on geography for safety. Technology had collapsed the map. The Mustang's long flight from Iwo Jima to Japan was the line that erased the horizon. In the decades that followed, the same principle defined the world. Jet bombers, ballistic missiles, satellites, computers, all were the children of that revelation. Humanity had learned how to compress space and time until the boundaries of nations blurred. What began as a tactical advantage became the architecture of a global civilization, and yet each generation that looks back at the Mustang also sees the cost. The perfection of engineering that made it so graceful also made it so lethal. Its success was measured not in beauty, but in the precision of destruction. Every rivet told a story of ambition and fear, of the endless race between invention and understanding. That paradox is why the Mustang still moves people today. When it flies over modern cities, at commemorations, air shows, or anniversaries, its sound is haunting, beautiful, impossible to ignore. Children look up in awe, veterans close their eyes, and historians take notes. To some, it is the voice of victory. To others, it is the echo of warning. To all, it is the sound of what humanity can do when it refuses to accept its limits. In Tokyo, a generation born long after the war now visits the Chiron Peace Museum, where the last surviving Ki-84 Hayate rests. Its battered fuselage faces a photograph of a P-51D, both displayed under the same light. Visitors read the plaques in silence: 2 machines, 2 nations, 1 story. The museum's curators did not place them there to celebrate or to condemn, but to remind progress and destruction are often built from the same blueprint. The historians who study these aircraft today see them not as relics of combat, but as milestones of human evolution. They mark the moment when flight ceased to be a dream and became a force that could shape the destiny of continents. The Mustang story, and that of its Japanese counterpart, forms a bridge between centuries, from the age of propellers to the age of circuits, from the courage of pilots to the cold precision of drones. As the 21st century races forward with new technologies redefining what is possible, the lesson of 1945 remains unchanged. The real measure of progress is not in the range of our machines, but in the wisdom with which we use them. The Mustang's legacy at its core is a moral one. Mastery of the sky means nothing without mastery of ourselves, and so the P-51 endures in hangars and documentaries, in the memories of those who once saw it against the dawn. Its silver wings catch the light, as they always did, gleaming not just with the reflection of the sun, but with the reflection of everything humanity became in its pursuit of power. If you listen closely, you can still hear it, that deep rhythmic thrum rolling across time, the heartbeat of an age that learned to conquer the air, and in doing so discovered both its greatness and its grief. The Mustangs over Tokyo were not merely a battle won. They were the moment the world learned that invention and responsibility must rise together, or else both will fall.